Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I am Sarah Stalker with Contact North. I am here to facilitate this afternoon's Ontario Native Literacy Coalition webinar, and it's my pleasure to introduce your webinar moderator, Yuma Hester. Over to you, Yuma.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks for the introduction, as well as all of the behind-the-scenes stuff that you do, the virtual hosting duties. Super appreciate everything you do. No way any of this would be possible without you. As Sarah said, my name is Yuma Hester, and I'm a half Cree, half Anishinaabe. Cree side from Moose Factory, and Anishinaabe side from Neoshingaming. And I wanted to welcome everybody, welcome our esteemed participants, the supporters, everybody who's joined us today. Thanks so much for taking the time out to be with us. And now, whether you've been a part of the webinars in the past, or this is your first webinar that you've attended, want to say thanks for being here and just offer a huge extended welcome. Before we get going, a couple of sort of housekeeping items. So I wanted to just acknowledge a former webinar participant, a former webinar speaker that we had, Dr. Lorna Williams, and she spoke at these webinars in 2018. Basically, she has been a huge mentor. So I know to specifically to Michelle Davis at ONLC, and we thank her on behalf of ONLC for her contributions to the Indigenous education and for her advocacy of Indigenous language revitalization programs. And want to extend a huge congratulations to her for her continuous advocacy. And she's just receiving the Order of Canada. So huge sort of like applause for her. The presentation is going to go on for about 45 minutes. And what will happen is I'll be sharing my screen. So I'll be sharing a PowerPoint presentation by a presenter, who I'll introduce in a second. And it'll have like a slide deck. And if you have any questions, basically just hold on to them until the end of the presentation. And if you absolutely can't and you need to like write it down, please write it in the chat box. And we'll be sure to try and get to as many of the questions as possible. And I think that's it. And without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Donald Fixico, who's an American writer and intellectual. He's also a Distinguished Foundation Professor of History at Arizona State University. He was the Thomas Bolus Distinguished Professor of American History, the CLAS Scholar, and the founding director of the Center for Indigenous Nation Studies at the University of Kansas. So, and with that, I'll hand it over to you, good sir.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be a part of the program. And so I very much enjoy being here with all of you and hope to share with you at least one perspective on oral tradition and traditional knowledge. And a little bit about background. I was born in Oklahoma, and so I am Muscogee Creek and Seminole on my father's side and kind of grew up in that tradition. And on my mother's side, I am Shawnee and Sac and Fox. And so in growing up in Oklahoma and then educated at the University of Oklahoma, I took 3 degrees from there and majored in history, which turned out to be more American Indian history. And so I've been in the field of history, teaching and researching and writing American Indian history for about 40 years. And I've been at several universities, 4 on faculty and 7 visiting professorships during this time since about 1980. So what I want to do today is to talk about oral tradition and traditional knowledge. I'm actually trained as a policy historian studying federal Indian policy in the United States, and also ethnohistory, which means studying cultural history, but also studying oral history and oral tradition. So you have before you the central elements, 4 elemental powers of the fire, of water, of wind, and the earth. And in the Muscogee Creek and Seminole tradition, then these four elemental powers then really kind of affect the entire planet from the perspective of Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles. And so the Seminole part of me is actually an offshoot of the Muscogee Creeks from the southeast part of the United States. And so the Seminoles are actually Muscogee Creek Seminoles, Seminoles who are really deep into the southern part of Florida are Seminoles, but they're actually Miccosukee Seminoles, which they speak a different language than the Muscogee Creek Seminoles. So I am a Muscogee Creek Seminole. Therefore, they speak the same language and have the same kind of belief system, worldview, as we'll talk about. So if we can go to the next slide, then I want to begin by talking about just, something called a book. And so it was before 1704 AD that woodblock printing actually began in Korea. And so it was in 1439 that Johannes Gutenberg then produced the press, the printing press. And so this is kind of fixed kind of characters. And so this began the printing process. And so we have from that time period from 1439 to about 2010, something like 130 million books have been produced throughout the entire world. And as I was looking at doing some fact checking last night, I think this is really kind of an undercount. And so there has to be more than that many books because at least more than 1 million books are published every year. But when you look at the English language, during the time of Shakespeare, there were like 540,000 words that were used in the English language. And now we have roughly about 1 million words in the English language. And so when you take the English language and you put it with printing, printing of books, literature, pamphlets, things like that, then that's referred to as print capitalism. And print capitalism actually kind of persuades people to kind of believe in a certain way. It educates them in a certain way, and that is called the power of rhetoric. And so when you look throughout the entire world, there's a little over 7,000 living languages that are being spoken. And so English is just one of those. But when you look at native languages, indigenous languages, First Nations peoples in Canada, and also native languages in the US, there's about 300 living Indian languages. And so we, as Native people, then express our own ideas, our worldviews in our native languages. And then we also then kind of interpret them through the English language itself. So just to give you some idea about the power of the books, the power of print capitalism, and the power of rhetoric. And if we can go to the next slide. And so just some facts on listening. So we spend about 75% every day communicating. And so about 55% of our daily time is listening to conversations, listening to other people. And the average person speaks about 125 to about 175 words a minute. On the average, we listen to about 450 words per minute. But what I find striking is that we only remember about 17 to 25% of what we hear or what we listen to. And so communication is so important, not just through the book and literacy, but through the words convey only about 7% of what a person is trying to say. And it's really kind of 93% that it is conveyed is actually through facial expressions and voice tone. Now, some of you may be cat people, some of you may be dog people, but animals actually kind of recognize the tone, and the tones really kind of become words to them so that they understand, not particularly the words, but the tone is more kind of the way of understanding. Now, if you take language and you take understanding as two kind of separate entities, then really its understanding supersedes language. For example, you can go to a foreign country and you can barter, and you don't necessarily have to know the language of the people who are there, but through hand gesturing, gesticulation, even just writing numbers down and then turning the numbers around if you're buying something, then the person who speaks a different language can see the number and then cross it out and then give a new number of what they want to sell their item for if you're in a store. And so it's really kind of understanding supersedes language. And so that's why I guess words only convey about 7% of what we're trying to say every day. And if you listen to people complaining, the last point here being that listening to complaints destroys brain problem solving skills after about 30 minutes of listening to people. So I'll try to make this presentation interesting to you. So Yuma, if we can go to the next one. So oral tradition is really kind of a tool. It's a teaching tool, telling stories, how that we tell stories. And knowing Native people is really understanding their stories and understanding them complete. Not just to hear the story, but to understand the depth of the story, the context of the story. And so when we tell stories in the oral tradition, then it's really from our background or our native ethos, the way that we see things and understand things. And really it's in the context of relationships. It's all about relationships, and not just human to human relationships, but human to animal relationships, human to plant relationships, human to the metaphysical, and understanding relationships in a whole in a much larger way than we normally would think. So that sharing knowledge through oral tradition is a way of sharing knowledge, but the oral tradition can also be used to tell funny stories, humor, so it's also used for entertaining. And the oral tradition is also used for sharing just information, news about the weather, about the approaching enemy, or something that has happened in the past. So sharing information. One of the main points I want to talk about today is that I sincerely believe that Native people who are close to their traditions, meaning knowing their ways and perhaps practice those ways, then are really kind of more circular in their logic and also more visual in their logic. And so it's circularity and visuality that is really important and really kind of makes, I think, Native people different from mainstream individuals because we're more circular and more visual. And so let me just kind of tell you a very quick story. I was teaching when I was an assistant professor. And so I was teaching at 4:30 in the afternoon, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I didn't want to teach this required US history course. The students had to take the course because it was part of the curriculum. And so they didn't like being there too. And lo and behold, on this one particular afternoon, it's kind of dreary outside, and I'm teaching about Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, not a very popular president, very boring, kind of annoying at sometimes, a Republican in the 1920s. And so what I did was to write Calvin Coolidge in the middle of the blackboard. And so if you remember what blackboards are, maybe some of you do, that in the middle of the blackboard, I wrote Calvin Coolidge, and then off to one corner, I wrote Republican, and off to another, I wrote laissez-faire, and another, I wrote the 1920s, another, I wrote economics. And so I circled all of those different words and then drew lines to Calvin Coolidge so that they were like spokes on a wheel to the central point, and the central idea of the lecture was Calvin Coolidge. And so it was like spokes on a wheel. And so one student shot up her hand really quick and said, Professor Fixico, why don't you write your notes in the upper left-hand corner and go from left to right and then go from left to right in the next sentence and so forth? And so it dawned on me that I was approaching teaching that course from a circular approach, a circularity. And the students were expecting to learn in a very linear fashion. So you can imagine that my teaching evaluations were not the greatest for that semester. And so what I had to do was to learn how to teach in a very linear fashion while being a circular person by nature. But it also, as I thought about that many years later, that while the students in that very class were taking notes from left to right, then the rotation of the earth was more in a circular fashion. So that's the point right there. And so it's coming from that kind of point of view, that kind of native logic. And if you take native logic and you put it into the context of an indigenous reality, it is not just the physical reality that we live in, but also includes physical reality. And so those two physical realities and metaphysical reality combined is really indigenous reality. that I think, and I'm convinced, that dreams and visions are very much a part, including nightmares, are a part of our reality as Native people. And so this is Indigenous reality. Sometimes I ask in lectures on this very subject, well, do you believe in ghosts? And someone said, and so this has been said before by other people through time, that I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm afraid of ghosts. So, uh, so but ghosts and spirits, visions, dreams are very much a part of Indian reality. And so when you hear stories told in the oral tradition way, you have the role of the storyteller, you have the role of listeners. And so they're sharing a moment, and that sharing a moment is called a shared experience. And it is a kind of a togetherness. And so in that togetherness, that shared experience creates a bond between the storyteller and the listeners. And so they share that moment in that story as it becomes alive and becomes very powerful and brings the past into the present and the present into the future. And so you can literally get lost in a story. And throughout this time, I will probably tell you a couple of stories, and hope to be effective about that in the role of a storyteller. And so let's go to the next. So I want to talk to you today about Indigenous knowledge. I will try to say that there are two kinds of Indigenous knowledge, at least in my perspective. And the one that I really want to talk about is organic Indigenous knowledge. So that within Indigenous knowledge, then there's local knowledge, and that is like where that you live. You know the kinds of trees and the flowers and the grasses and the waters. You might know where plants are and certain kinds of trees and certain herbs. Uh, where you go shopping, stores, things like that. And so that's referred to as kind of a local knowledge, And so everybody has a local knowledge in living in different parts of the country, living in different parts of the world. There is also something I refer to as embedded knowledge. And embedded knowledge is the knowledge that has been shared with you and that you've learned uh, since a child, and you kind of have an instinct for that kind of knowledge, and it's very much a part of you. In fact, it's a part of your identity and who you are. And so that sometimes that local knowledge becomes embedded as kind of a deep knowledge that I refer to. And so that knowledge is very powerful. And so you know what is right and you know what is wrong according to this embedded knowledge that you've grown up with and you've been taught by your elders. I also think that there's a kind of a sacred knowledge. And the sacred knowledge is really that people who are medicine people have that kind of knowledge. They're really kind of, in my view, a kind of a gifted individual, so that they know certain things about herbs, healing, curing, ceremonies, and things like that. And I also, I have out here in parentheses that this really kind of involves tribal ethics, guidelines, and really kind of laws, if you will, that yes, if this is sacred knowledge, then that shouldn't really be shared. It should be respected, because only certain individuals who have that sacred knowledge have the abilities and perhaps the right to practice that kind of sacred knowledge and share it only in certain times for curing, for good purposes. There's also, I want to say, in this kind of categories of knowledge, a kind of a medicine or earth knowledge. And that is really where that all people of a tribal community, First Nations people of a particular group, for example, know the earth. They know the patterns, the cycles of growth and the movement of animals and things like that. And so that's really kind of beyond local knowledge, and is much more kind of in depth in knowing about the earth and how that it functions in cycles and rotations and things like that, growing seasons and so forth. And so that sharing knowledge is a way of learning. It's a kind of a teaching tool that we tell stories, and stories, not just, just saying, well, I just heard a story, but stories in a very sincere way. And this is how that we learn. So that we learn through stories, but we also learn and practice sharing knowledge through kind of an apprentice-like way of watching somebody who knows how to make a bow or knows how to hunt. You are with that person. Usually it's an uncle or your father or a grandmother, and they teach you certain things. And then as you see them doing those certain things, then you imitate them like an apprentice. And so this way of obtaining knowledge is through kind of imitation or through kind of an apprentice-like practice. And so that's the second way of sharing knowledge or learning. And another way is through observation, and just by observing other people, kind of like an apprentice, but really kind of watching animals, studying a river, looking at the weather, observing it. Then we obtain knowledge that way. We might think of it as just kind of information, but actually it becomes knowledge as we watch certain animals as they do certain things, how that they live, how that they hunt, how that they take care of their young and so forth. And so that kind of observation is really a way of obtaining knowledge and learning something new if we just kind of keep our eyes open and our minds open to learning that way. The other kind of sharing of knowledge or learning is really through kind of divine intervention, that basically all of a sudden, you realize, so that's why that happens. Or, hey, I never thought of it, but that's the way that things were meant to be. Sometimes through a dream, or maybe through a vision, or somebody else's vision, or something like that, that there's kind of an intervention of saying, and it's really kind of an aha moment. Oh, I really didn't know that. So that kind of moment of realization is really kind of maybe perhaps our mind subconsciously had been working on something, trying to figure out the answer to a problem. And then all of a sudden we're struck by the answer. And so that kind of divine intervention just kind of happens. And so we have really no control over it, but it's just one of those kind of aha moments where that things happen. So through stories, there's one kind of learning, through imitation or the apprentice-like, and through observation and through divine intervention, like through visions and dreams and so forth, then we have those different kinds of knowledges and how that we learn. And Yuma, if we can go to the next. So just to give you some kind of idea visually, that this is North America, and that originally, at least from what I've been able to find, that there was something like 2.1 million First Nations people in Canada. And at the arrival of Columbus, about maybe 5.2 million Indigenous people in the United States. And so when we look at that kind of comparison in 1492 and earlier, and then compare it to today's population, roughly 1 million First Nations people, at least that I was able to find on the internet, and about 5.2 million American Indians in the United States. And so in looking at the map, my point here is this is the homeland of First Nations people, the homeland of American Indians in the United States, also into Mexico. And so homeland, but really I want to talk about that and for us to think about that in terms of the earth, and the earth as being one of the elemental powers that is kind of within throughout all of this presentation. And so the earth being very important and homeland being a part of the earth, not just the soil on top that most people refer to as land, but what is under the earth and what is above the earth still being a part of the earth in that kind of sense, and being one of the four elemental powers that I want to refer to. And so Yuma, if we can go to the next, please. So looking at this image right here and just kind of study it just for a little bit. So really you have all of the four elements that I've referred to that are elemental powers. The lightning that is striking the ground that we can't see because of the dark is actually the earth. We have the wind in the tornado that is swirling. And so that is another one of the elements. And the lightning that is striking the ground is really fire in itself. And the clouds that you see above and part of the tornado is really kind of the rainfall or the storm, the rainstorm that is part of all of this. And my point here is that this is what happened, this kind of very powerful moment, or this tornado that might last for several minutes, is when these powers come together, they're so great, they're much greater than any kind of power that ever produced by mankind, that they're greater than we are, and we need to kind of respect these kind of powers, because they can be very dangerous. They can take lives, kill loved ones, and things like that. And so we need to be very cognizant and respectful of these powers that, in my view, and the way that I was brought up, then control all of our lives, past, present, and future still. And so, Yuma, can we go to the next, please? So I want to tell you a little story, and that how that the Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles then talk about the tornado, because the tornado, we refer to it as the big wind. And if you look at that term off to the right, is horole. Horole is wind, and thako is big wind, but not just big meaning large in size, but big meaning important, big kind of meaning dangerous, big meaning you better watch out for it. And so the story goes that a long time ago, there was a little boy, and you see the image of a little boy and a little girl who are dancing. They're holding hands, and now they're holding hands. The little boy, and in the Muscogee Creek and Seminole language, is referred to as Chipani. And so the first word there is Chipani. And so that's the little boy. The little girl is Hokti. That's the word for little girl. So Chipani and Hokti, meaning the little boy and little girl, then was not listening to their parents, was not listening to the mother. And she said, Wegas, Wegas Chipani, Wegas Hokti, Wegas, which means stop, stop. And so as they were dancing and holding hands, they swirled around, they turned around, they turned around, they turned around. And as the mother would repeatedly say, Wegas, stop, they didn't stop. And as they kept turning around and kept turning around, getting dizzy and so forth, then that created the tornado. And as a tornado then was created, it came from the heavens above and down and touching the earth. And so this is how the Muscogee Creeks and the Seminoles say that the tornado, the idea of it, the creation of it, first came into existence. So a little bit more about this. So when a tornado happens, it's a great dangerous wind. And so we believe that it's an elder that then goes out and talks to the winds, and to find a sharp object, even if it's not a knife, then perhaps even just a sharp stone that has a sharp edge, and you hold it towards Hodolithako, and you ask for it to divide itself, and for the winds to divide and to go around you or to go over you. And so usually it's the elder. We believe in clans. And so if you're of the wolf clan or the bear clan or the deer clan or the tiger clan, then or the bird clan, then it's the senior person of that particular clan, and it's their duty to go out, their responsibility, and to pray to Hodolithako with the sharp object to go around the people and to leave the people to be safe. We also have another saying that, and old timers, I was told this when I was growing up as a kid, that a lot of the roads, during the old days weren't paved. They were dirt roads, not concrete or anything like that. And so the old saying was, Izaknamizi no kichka. And Izaknamizi is the deity that controls all of the wind, the air, the oxygen, a whisper, a song that a bird sings, even Hodolithako, a tornado. And so that's the deity. It's really referred to as the master of breath. And so that is referring to that deity. And Nokichka means to hold your head up. Hold your head up and look towards the sky. Hold your head up when you're traveling and look where you're going. Metaphorically, he's talking about saying Nokichka means to look up at the sky and to see where you're going in life. Just life in general on your life's journey is to keep your head up and to see where you're going. Okay, thank you. So let's go to the next. And so another elemental powers, this is a quick kind of shot of the major rivers in Canada and also the United States. And so when you see, we're surrounded by the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean and the Arctic Ocean, water plays a very central part of all of our lives. And that 75% of our body, human body, consists of water. So water being very important to life, and also being one of those kind of elemental powers that I've referred to, in addition to fire and earth and wind. And let's go to the next. So another idea here is an image of the Mississippi River, one of the longest rivers in the US. And there's a story about rivers and lakes, that we need to be very respectful of these lakes, at least according to the traditions I grew up with, the Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles, was that we believe that there's a serpent that has horns. Sometimes it has two horns, sometimes it has only one horn, and it's referred to as the water king. And so why do people drown? Well, we believe that it's the water king that pull people under, and so that they drown. And so the water king follows the course of rivers and kind of goes back and forth as it lives underwater. And so it's a part of the underworld that the Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles believe. And so we're very careful. They say the old thing, as I was growing up, if you're at a lake or a river where that the water is very calm, watch it very carefully, because the calmness of the water is really the invitation of the water king to draw you to that area, because they're going to pull you under. If you're fishing in a boat, it'll be capsized, and if you're certainly swimming, or even if you're fishing on the bank, don't be so attracted to that calmness of the water, because it's kind of pulling you towards it and wanting you to enter the water, and so it'll then pull you under and drown you. So let's go to the next. So all of this that I've talked about so far, I'm referring to is kind of Indian thought or Indian thinking. It's really kind of a native logic. And so this is, I'm going to say, from my point of view, is really kind of universal. If you're close to your native traditions, people who are close to native traditions, and people who are not Indian, but who grew up close to native people and who knows their traditions and might practice those traditions and ceremonies and things. So that native people, I think, are more circular in thought, that they kind of see things and kind of repeat themselves. I'm one of those individuals that kind of repeat myself from time to time, but I want people to kind of understand that I said something that I think might be important. So you have a tendency to repeat that. In the linear fashion, the linear academia, then it's called repetition and writing books and articles, and that's not a good thing. But circularity and circular thought is a part of Indian thinking and native logic. There's also something I want to refer to. It's called natural democracy. Natural democracy is a concept I've been working with, that I developed, and it's the idea of having a natural respect for all things, all people, all plants, all animals, all things, and that's what I'm referring to as natural democracy. So it's mutual respect, as you respect even your enemy. Back in historic times, like when my people, the Muscogee Creeks, went to war against the Cherokees, then the Cherokees also mutually respected the Creeks for their power, especially on the battlefield. And so there's that mutual respect, but a mutual respect for animals and for plants, for the planets, the sky, the sun, the moon, the earth, and so forth. Indian thinking, also native logic, is also the presence of the metaphysical. To be of that frame of mind is to believe that spirits are real. You may not see them, but sometimes you can feel the presence of a being or somebody else, or someone like this. I mean, even in the house that I live in right here, the person that lived in this house previously had cancer. He died. And from time to time, I can actually feel the presence of that person, who is a non-native person. But I get the sense that he is wanting me to, kind of checking up on me to see if I'm taking care of the house. And I will tell him, it's like somebody, you feel like somebody's looking over your shoulder. And I'll just kind of turn around and kind of say, I'm doing the best I can to take care of the house. So we kind of get that sense of beings who are spiritual, and maybe through visions or dreams or something like that. But that's very much a part of reality for Native people. And another part of this Indian thinking and Native logic is understanding relationships. It's really not saying, okay, this is how I relate to everybody and everybody should understand me, but understanding the relationships with your pets, animals, plants, mountains, trees, and things like that, literally everything. And we don't do that enough as a people, but Native people who are really kind of scholars of nature, of the natural environment, then do understand those relationships, because understanding the relationships, it could be very much the supply of water that would keep you alive. And that kind of local knowledge of knowing where water sources are, where firewood might be, where that wild plants that could be eaten for a part of your diet, and understanding those relationships is really important. And not just a human to human relationship, but a human to non-human relationships as well, with mountains and trees and meadows and deserts and all entities. That's a part of the natural democracy. And Yuma, can we go to the next? So place really kind of connects us, grounds us to a particular part of the planet, a part of Mother Earth. And so I want to refer to this as kind of a natural symbiosis, meaning that we depend on the earth, but the earth also depends on us. So it's a mutual dependence going back and forth that involves sacred places or powerful places, that kind of mutual dependence or symbiosis, but also to our home, because as we're connected to our home, and it could very well be homeland or home space, then that helps to define our identity of who that we are. To understand Native people and to know who they are is to also understand where that they come from and who they're connected to in that kind of home space and homeland and that part of the earth. This is really kind of a natural connection and natural places. There might be certain places that are really kind of powerful. Maybe that you have a certain place that you like to go, maybe sitting by a particular river, maybe looking out here in the Southwest in Arizona. Is I see Red Mountain, and every time I see Red Mountain, and there's the Red Mountain Freeway, I fly in to Phoenix, but every time I see Red Mountain, I know that I'm almost home. And so when I drive from my campus, from Arizona State University to my home, it's like 22 miles away, and I see Red Mountain, I know that I'm close to being home. So that kind of natural environment, and so Red Mountain is actually a sacred place to the Native people in this area. But also place can be human-made, made by human beings, and so those places can also be a part of us and part of our identity. During the relocation years in the 1950s in the United States, when people were moved from rural areas and reservations or reserves to the cities, then cities formed particular neighborhoods, like Native people in Chicago then formed their own kind of neighborhoods. People in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle or Phoenix or Oklahoma City then formed new places of, and I call it kind of a new tribalism, so that that became human-made. And so we adopt new places, and sometimes it's new places that have been made by human people, people ourselves. Can we go to the next, please? And so certain places are very powerful. This is a picture of the Bighorn medicine wheel. And so this was made really kind of early by early Native astronomers. It could very well be about 2,500 years ago, that this was really a kind of a cosmological map of the universe at night. And so there's like 75 of these medicine wheels in the United States and also in Canada. And so these are kind of just kind of here and kind of there, usually kind of higher points. This is in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. And so I've been there a few times, but it's really kind of a place of quiet, of calm, and quite a bit of pondering of, what were the people thinking? What was on their minds? What was important to them when they constructed this medicine wheel a long time ago in other places like that? That meant that they were studying the earth, they were studying the planets, they were studying the stars, and trying to obtain new knowledge by observation and relating that to the local knowledge that they had of this area and other places where these other 70 plus medicine wheels are located throughout North America. And let's go to the next. So sacred places like the Black Hills in South Dakota and Wyoming are really important to the Native groups in the area. But other places, and let's go to the next, Yuma. And so other places like Taos Blue Lake, among the Taos Pueblo people in New Mexico, this particular lake itself is really where that they say that according to their legends and myths and stories where that they emerged from. And so this is a very powerful place to them. Also the Serpent Mound next, just, well, the Ohio River, if you can imagine, would be just below this kind of line of trees. And so you see the effigy of the Serpent Mound. And so the Ohio River, we know, used to, and does not as much, used to flood every year in the spring. So this is kind of emblematic that it's a serpent, you know, the water itself, then kind of acting in that rush when the heavy rains would occur in spring. And so this is really kind of telling the people, warning people, you know, be careful of the water itself. And maybe it's connected to the water king that talked about a little bit earlier, that maybe this is a water king in the Ohio River that swims up and down the Ohio River and into other tributaries of the Ohio and so forth. And so we have a kind of connection of the myth that I talked about a little bit earlier about the Water King and the Serpent Mound itself that was built by early people of the Mississippian mound building period when a lot of mound building was done. We have in the St. Louis area, again, the Mississippi River there, but also the great mound building complex called Cahokia. And so the great mound building site there where about 75,000 people lived at one time. Really in comparison to history, much greater than St. Louis, because Cahokia was like the place to go because there was a huge mound and other smaller mounds built in that large complex. And let's go to the next. So we have natural democracy in that we talked about that a little bit earlier in this kind of social cultural relationship, this kind of natural symbiosis of relationships, not just human to human, but human to animal and human to plant and human to the landscape and human to the supernatural. And so all that being very important in this kind of idea or this concept of natural democracy, really kind of based on mutual respect in this kind of natural symbiosis. And let's go to the next. So when we look at the entire planet, this is really kind of an undercount, but we have this number of species of mammals and reptiles and insects and birds and flowering plants and ferns and algae and microalgae, just to give you an idea of how many species around throughout the entire planet that we know of. And so let's go to the next. So when you take of the species and look at them, the ones that are most common to native people, then this is just a sample of buffalo and bear and wolf and eagle and antelope and deer and birds, certain birds and others. Then you have these kind of subspecies of these different main species of buffalo, bear, and wolf and so forth. But native people, my point being, is that they had a relationship with the buffalo. They had a relationship with the bear and with the wolf. And so if you were a wolf person, then you studied the wolf, you knew the strengths of the wolf. And so that was local knowledge, as that would become kind of embedded knowledge because you would know everything and how a wolf hunts, how a wolf is kind of logical in making its own decisions of whether to hunt or not hunt or to kill or not to kill. And so a person who studies the wolf then almost becomes like the wolf or becomes like the antelope or becomes like the bear. So somebody will say, oh, he's acting like a wolf, or she might be acting like a bear because you study, you're of that clan, you're of that group. And so you kind of take on the characteristics because you're really kind of a natural scholar of that particular animal. And so your relationship is to that animal. By watching those particular animals, then we begin to learn a lot about them in their behavior and how they act and make their own decisions, their instincts and all of that. Because if they've been around before people, then we learn from them that kind of knowledge, natural knowledge. And so we learn from animals. And let's go to the next. So we understand cycles of life, and we understand the cycles of animals and plants and planets. And so understanding day and night, and so the seasons and weather patterns and rotations of the stars and the earth, migrations of animals. And so this is part of learning, but this is through observation and sharing stories about what we know, sharing local knowledge in terms of stories and the oral tradition. So this is a passing or teaching the younger people of our tribal communities. And so this is one way, but to know that everything works in very much of a circular pattern or rotations is really important. And let's go to the next. So when we look at communities, and this, in the middle, it could be any First Nations group, it could be Cheyenne, it could be Mohawk, and so forth. In the middle, just using this as a theoretical kind of idea that within that circle, that I want to say that there's the person or people is really important within that community, within that circle. There's also the extended family, meaning the immediate family that also has an uncle or a grandparent or grandparents living with them, which makes the extended family. And so you have people, individuals within that extended family, but you also might belong to a clan or a group or society. And so that element is also, that social element is a part of that community, part of that circle, which could very well be a community itself. Or there could be 4 or 5 communities like this one that would constitute or make up a tribe or a First Nations group. But within all of the circle, within that community, all of these elements are there. And the 6th one being what holds it together is really kind of a bond or a people, but I'm going to say a kind of a spirituality that holds all of these elements together. And that's important. And let's go to the next. So finding balance is, I'm going to say, is really kind of an optimal moment. When there's balance, that everything is really good, everything is perfect. It's a very good feeling in your heart and throughout your soul when you find balance within yourself. At a family gathering, like a birthday, a holiday or something like that, a good meal, then there's that kind of harmony within your family and within yourself. And for that to happen, it's really kind of, it's a moment that doesn't happen very often, but when you find it happening within your clan or society and also in your community, when all of those things are like kind of lined up, and then also with the environment, that is true balance. And that balance you feel in with external entities like animals or your neighbors across your relations, relatives, and all of that. That's the optimal moment. That's a moment of harmony. And let's go to the next. And I want to tell you a quick story, so that it was at Tallahassee Stomp Ground, and that was in 2001, almost 20 years ago. My son's 25, and so he was 6 years old at the time. And so we drove to Hectorville to the Stomp Ground to dance. I come from the Green Corn tradition, so where that we dance around a fire at night. There's no flashlights, and people use flashlights, but you don't use them in the dance. And so we're really kind of dancing sunwise, and this is just an image. But you can see this right here. You can see the moon, you can see the fire, and you have in text here the word me. So that's me standing there, just figuratively. And so you have this person who's leading the song, and this is my dad's name, John. And the person who's right directly across from him is a young person, but imagine that being a little boy. And my son, his name is Keitha. And so Keitha, and his middle name is John, named after my dad. And so that's his granddad, John, my father, who's leading the song. And so as my son, imagine a young boy, half the standing there. And my dad is across leading the song, leading the dance. And I'm getting ready to enter the dance. So I'm standing there and I'm watching the fire. And I was just so amazed by the fire. And then I looked up and there was the moon. And in about 2 seconds, my father crossed in front of me, between me and the fire. And my son crossed at that same moment in line with the fire and the moon. And so as we stood there, me, my father, the fire, my son, Keitha on the other side, and the moon, we were all lined up in harmony for that one optimal moment. And at that moment, as I saw that, 3 generations dancing at the same time to the fire that is very elemental. And then with the moon, everything was perfect. Everything was wonderful for that one split second that sometimes referred to as an optimal moment. Can we go to the next? So there's spiritual peace and balance, or in harmonies. We find balance within ourselves, with families, the clan, and society. Those are structured in terms of like the great law of peace of the Haudenosaunee, or the League of the Iroquois, among the Cheyenne Council of 44, among the red and white towns of the Muscogee Creeks. We refer to a term called boy Fixico, which means spiritual energy, or it could be like a sovereign way of life. The Navajos here in the Southwest talk about walking in beauty, referred to as Hosho. And so this is really kind of living a life of balance, or trying to, the desire is to live in that particular fashion, to find peace within ourselves. And let's go to the next. And so I'm also wanting to say that there are universal constants, that life is a journey. And so as we, in all of our lives, each of us, that we know that there's day and night, and that there's men and women, there's male and female, sun and moon, right and wrong, happiness and sadness, victory and defeat, and all of this, war and peace, life and death, and so forth. And so it's really walking the road, the journey, in this is on the left and this is on the right. Good is on the left and bad is on the right. And making these decisions. And so as we walk through life on this life's journey, it is said by my Muscogee Creek people and Seminole people and about a half a dozen others that we then will walk in the end, and life continues, but in a very spiritual way. And we walk and we start at the Milky Way. And the Milky Way is the last journey, because as we go to the spiritual side on the other side of life, and it's also said, according to oral tradition, that when a person dies who believes in this Milky Way system, that the Milky Way will actually become a little bit brighter. And so it's like a path that has been kind of lit up, because then we know that that's the time that someone has passed, and that they then will walk on the journey, the last journey to the Milky Way, to get to the other side of life, to join loved ones that have passed away. And let's go to the next. So when we look at American Indian history or Native history, it's about relationships, and it's really kind of a binary of Indian-white relationships. And I want to suggest to you that of the 30,000 books, more than that, about First Nations, probably closer to 40,000 or 50,000 books, 2020 here, that really they're written about Native people, meaning from the white mainstream perspective. So from the first dimension or the first door, and going across this equation. So it's only in the second dimension, or the interaction or the shared experience, that we are now talking about, and we're writing books and articles about, and even making movies and documentaries about the boarding school experience, or about wars where that Native people were an actual equal partner in this kind of presentation or interpretation of history, or sharing of knowledge. And so from the Native side, the Native perspective, like turning a coin over and looking from the Native perspective, then that's the third dimension. But if you look at it from the Native side across the equation to the right side, the third dimension actually becomes the first dimension, because it's from their perspective, which I've been trying to talk about during this presentation. So I wrote about this in a book called Call for Change, The Medicine Way of American Indian History, Ethos, and Reality. Then let's go to the next. So in this, and again, Muscogee could be any group. It could be Navajo, could be Mohawk, could be Cree, and so forth. But I'm suggesting that in that circle, then there's a mutual kind of a natural democracy of respect with another Indian group, like the Cherokee, but also kind of the symbiotic relationship with the French and with the English and the Spanish, and even the metaphysical and even the animal world and plant, and also the unknown. So it's all about relationships, but that relationships go back and forth among all of these entities. And Yuma, let's go to the next. And so this figure means that the Creeks Muscogee Creeks who have this mutual relationship with the Cherokees, but the Cherokees also have the similar relationship with the animals. And so the Cherokees was also have a relationship with the metaphysical world and going across with the plant world. And so this kind of two-dimensional configuration then becomes more like a sphere, because then the Cherokees would have a relationship with the Spanish, with the English, and all of this. And so this two-dimensional configuration then becomes more of a sphere in all of the relationships of this kind of natural democracy. And let's go to the next. And so when you look at this diagram right here, then we see the earlier one of the sphere-like connection. Then I have the dotted line around here, and this is to illustrate this kind of spirituality, this belief, this in this worldview, and the jagged lines, kind of circular lines, are really kind of the natural environment. So I'm suggesting that the people of the Southwest, their influence and their thinking, their worldview, the way that they make their decisions, leaderships, is influenced by the natural environment of the Southwest or the Northwest coast of the First Nations, where that the water is important as a land. And so that kind of waterscape or landscape kind of combined influences the thinking of the people in that part of the country, would be kind of the natural environment. That this whole kind of model, this idea or this kind of theory then passes through time from the past in the present and into the future in the practice and this kind of belief in this natural democracy in this kind of natural world. And let's go to the next. And so the interesting relationship that is not so mutual, because I have the dotted lines, is when the Mohawks or when the Cheyennes or the Cherokees try to connect with the metaphysical world all the time, and we can't. It's dotted lines because we pray, we fast, we sing to connect, but the metaphysical world can connect with us anytime through dreams and visions and spirits and so forth. And let's go to the next. So that the unexplained and the power beyond, sometimes there are things that are missing and when something went wrong. It's extraordinary occurrences that we really can't explain, and we might say that there's a series of mishaps. Among the Creeks and the Seminoles, we talk about this as little people or Istilabochi. And so they live among us. They're about knee high to a grown man. And so they are very much a part of our belief system, and they're out there. And let's go to the next. So as illustrated, little people are around the world in various cultures, called leprechauns, called gnomes among the Germans, living in Switzerland, Netherlands, Sweden, sometimes referred to as trolls and fairies and elves, or pans and brownies and goblins. And so the idea of little people kind of, if you're missing something, you lost something, well, maybe a little person got it, but we believe that and a number of tribes, I know for sure, at least in the US, believe in little people. So they're there. A lot of times you can hear them, but you can't see them because they don't want you to see them. And let's go to the next. And so another way of kind of knowing things and of the unexplained is that about 3 dozen Indian groups in the United States that have read about have tribal coyote stories. And so the coyote stories, the coyote is the cultural hero. Sometimes he's a buffoon. Sometimes he is a she, and sometimes he is he and she both. So is kind of a hero or a coyote is there to kind of explain the irony of life. And so this is an important role. And so many coyote stories are told about the trickster coyote. And so in the next slide, then we have this many of native groups who have coyote stories and believe in coyote, and coyote being very much a part of the culture, a part of the worldview, and as an important trickster. And let's go to the next. And so the trickster is also sometimes referred to as the raven, sometimes referred to as the hare. They say that when the hare is the trickster, that the hare, meaning the rabbit, will stand still, but don't gaze into the eye, don't gaze into the pupil, because the pupil will become larger and literally will kind of pull you and captivate you and pull you into it, kind of like Alice in Wonderland or something like that. But the tricksters help to kind of explain the unexplained, that something's missing or something went wrong or a series of mishaps. And so I have below the petroglyphs and the wampum belt of the Iroquois and the winter count through oral tradition and stories, but also Native people have written records or created documents like winter counts and wampum belts and petroglyphs, rock art and so forth to record the past, but also to record knowledge, that kind of organic knowledge that that Native people have. And let's go to the next. And so when we look at the metaphysical part of reality, then on the left, you have the column of medicine people and healers and prophets and seers and visionaries. And on the right side, you have the metaphysical side of deities that we are still trying to learn about, creators. There's not just one creator among some groups, but kind of a collection of creators, sacred powers and spirits and elements themselves that are not necessarily human in form, but they are there. And so we try to learn more about the metaphysical reality. And so in all, we have indigenous reality is a tandem, a combination of the physical and the metaphysical at the same time. And let's go to the next. And so just to kind of, we're getting close to the end, so thank you for your patience. But so it's the powers of the ancient elements, as I've mentioned, the earth and the wind and fire and water and so forth are there. And it's said that if you look into the fire is it begins to flicker, the flames begin to flicker. And if it's like a finger kind of pointed towards you, then you will kind of experience a kind of relationship and you might learn something. Something might kind of come to you and through realization, but it's a way of kind of watching the fire and learning the fire. Some people learn more through fire. Some people learn more through the earth. Some people learn more from water, or some people learn more from wind. And so, but these are like powers, but they're also kind of ways of learning and knowledge being shared by these other elements that are not human, but informing us of what to do, maybe some kind of prophecy, and helping us with major decisions, but they're there. We just need to kind of interpret their language or to interpret their codes or clues that they're leaving for us. And so we're still, we're like children still trying to learn about these elements. And let's go to the next. And I want to finish with this story. I'll be quick about it. It was a long time ago in about 1957. I was like 6 years old at the time. And at Shawnee Lake, this is a map of Oklahoma, and where the mark is red is just about where Shawnee is. So this is just a picture of two men who are out there fishing. And it was in the evening. And so Carl is a non-Indian person who lived next door, and my dad, John, and so being young men, being young parents at the time, Carl Briggs, they had like 6 kids. And so there's 4 of us in my family. And so they decided to go on a fishing trip. And so as they went on a fishing trip overnight at Shawnee Lake, they were just going to spend the night. So it was in the evening, they had gotten off work. And so they got into Carl's station wagon. And so Carl drove himself and my dad out to Shawnee Lake, and they cast their fishing lines out there into Shawnee Lake. So as they cast, it's getting dark, and getting dark is a very important time of the day, because it's just like the dawn, and it's when the power of light and dark comes together, just like in the morning. Those are very kind of portal times of power coming together, intersecting, meeting, encountering. And so as they threw their lines, the fishing lines, into the water, and Carl is sitting there, and he then looks at my dad, then he kind of stares at his float in the water. And then finally he turns to my dad and he says, do you hear that? And my dad heard it, but he didn't say that he heard it. He just kind of looked at Carl, and then Carl looked at his fishing line again in the water, the float just bobbing up and down. And he said, there it is again, John. He said, I hear Indians singing and dancing. And so the next time he heard it, he said, let's get out of here. So they were in such a hurry that Carl literally left his fishing stuff, and he started running towards his station wagon to get in. my dad had to run after him because Carl had given him a ride in Carl's station wagon. So we had to catch up with him. And so when they were sitting in the car and they were driving away and they left their fishing stuff out there, they said, "Oh, we'll get it the next day." And then Carl turned to my dad and said, "Did you hear those Indians singing and dancing?" And my dad nodded yes. But my dad also knew, my dad, John, knew all around that area, around Shawnee Lake, that there were no dance grounds, no stomp grounds. So what had happened is that at some time in the past, a dance fire at a stomp ground, like the image up here that I've showed you a little bit earlier, upper left-hand corner, then that ground was powerful and sacred and then came to life because you have the elements there. Carl and my dad had made a fire, a campfire, and so you have the element. They were there on the earth. So the water was there, and as the wind blew at the same time, it rekindled that ancient fire. Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I just wanted to let everyone know, thank you very much for attending. We are a little bit over, and if you have to go, completely understand. But we are going to do a little bit of questions as well. So if you have any questions, please do type them into the chat, and we'll get to them. But if you do have to go, again, Chimigwech, and yeah, there will be a short survey to complete on your way out. Thank you for being part of the webinar series. So now I do want to take up a little bit more of your time, if that's okay, Dr. Fixico.
I'm glad to answer any questions. So
Brilliant. Okay, so I think from Janice Hill, one of the first questions that we have is, so where do non-binary and two-spirit folks fit into this?
could you ask that question again?
So where do non-binary or two-spirit people fit into this? So people who I identify as like not with sort of set cisgender roles.
There's a place for them because they're among the Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles that I know best. Then for somebody who has two spirits, then that they have been created that way, that they have much more to offer than normal individuals. And so they're treated respect because they're different. And anybody who is different like that, then again, that kind of symbiosis that we depend on people like that, and then they find a home, you know, or a place around the fire, as we say, to be a part of the community. Native people, I believe, and certainly Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles are more inclusive rather than exclusive. And in order to be more inclusive, then we're able to learn more and be more broad-minded. But kind of coming into the community and everything, there's a kind of a general approach towards mutual respect. And so if we mutually respect somebody, they should respect us too. But we include them at the same time. And so we learn from individuals who are different. If we were all the same, then we wouldn't learn very much. And so we welcome those people who are different ways in their thinking, and their different ways they're being created, and all of that. And so we should respect people like that and invite them in to be a part of us.
I love that. I love that thinking. Just that, you know, having alternative sort of viewpoints in a way really expands our perception of things, you know, as like a group, right? So
yes, it does, and it can change. It can change us, but as long as we maintain, you know, the core values of who we are, we don't lose control over our core identity, and we still who we are, but we still adopt change at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Lisa Baumberry asks, thank you, you're an amazing storyteller. Do you think that foods can also be a part of home and peace?
Oh yeah, almost everything begins with a meal, the way that I was raised. And so it's a way of hospitality. And that's really important. And to understand, the foods and really the foods that we know that are good for us. And that has been changed considerably, at least in the US, with the dependency on government commodities and things like that, and bad foods that are not good for you. We know that it's a sad fact that just looking at my son is adopted, but 50% of Native people will have diabetes too. And so that means that my son or I will have, diabetes probably. And so by watching our foods and respecting our foods and taking it in the way it's supposed to be taken to nurture our bodies and everything, that should be a part of the local knowledge and embedded knowledge that we need to know.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just not a question, just a comment saying that the Water King does also sound like an Ojibwe creature called Mishpishi, and that's depicted in some of the rock paintings and the petroglyphs around this area up here in the Canadian Shield. Another question though from Kelly Main says, thank you. You mentioned the little people around the world. Are you aware of other common Indigenous practices or beliefs that are global in scope?
Not so much global in scope. I'm probably more familiar with Druids. I've lived for about a year in England, and when somehow I mentioned Istilabochi, and somebody asked, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, it means little people. Then I heard a whole lot about Druids and everything, and how they live in trees and things like that. And people are very accepting of them, that they are there. I mean, you don't have to be seen to be there, but you can be heard. And one of the things that I grew up with in the saying about little people, don't talk about them so much. The more that you talk about them, then they enter your mind, and that you're more thinking about them all the time. And it's a way of them drawing you to them. And the old saying too is, don't let your children play at the edge or near high grass or high weeds or trees, because little people want your children to come and play with them because they're about the same height. And so, but then if your child is lost, they're taken by little people, by Istilabochi, then sometimes they come back and they're different because they've been given a different kind of knowledge and they've been returned to you. And they become sometimes teachers because they've learned like earth knowledge from the little people themselves.
I love that. That reminds me similarly of like my son. We have a 5-year-old. He just turned 5, and we're sort of talking a little bit. My wife is Haudenosaunee, and myself Korean Ojibwe, but we sort of talked about like us all being on the turtle's back, and we're driving down the road, and he says, I can see like the turtle's back, right? Like kind of like on the highway. And in a way, sort of as parents, like he still has that strong connection to the spirit world. And we sort of like don't understand what to say no, and what to say yes. So sort of like what to foster in him as regards to his connection, but also like to keep him grounded sort of in this world. I don't know if you can offer up any advice, or if you've had that experience.
Well, a little bit. Among the Muscogee Creeks, there was a large confederacy that we once had, like 60 towns or more. And so the towns are divided up into red towns or white towns. And red towns were really kind of war towns, and the white towns were more kind of peace towns. In signing treaties, people coming from the red towns or war towns could not sign the treaties because they only knew war. And so it was really the white stick leaders. And so the red sticks meant that you carried the red battle club, going into battle. And so we watch our children when they're born, and then as they learn to speak and as they grow in the earliest ages, 1, 2, something like that. You're either a red stick or a white stick. So now my son is clearly a red stick. He is extroverted. He gets upset about injustice. And so he wants to rush out and change the world. And so I kind of groomed him and, pushed him towards that knowledge of, you don't fight every battle. You pick your battles and things like that. But a white stick and I'm a white stick, meaning that I'm more calm, I'm more introverted. I will kind of be more of the person who will read. I'm not rushed to quick judgment. I'll kind of take things in. And so the white stick, if you have a white stick child and you see them, push the books towards them, push, tribal heritage information, help them to learn that way. And so that's the way that they're going to be. And so we teach our children by kind of immediately figuring out, and they say, oh, yep, he's definitely, or she's definitely a red stick or the white stick. Now, that doesn't mean that, one will always be a red stick or a white stick, because in times of war, the white sticks did go to war and needed help, when they were needed. And so later on, a white stick will become a red stick upon necessity. And then the older that they get, the red stick will become a white stick, because as they're older in life and everything, then they can't go to war all the time or be in arguments all the time. But they're the ones that kind of, carry the argument. They're the ones who are out there, the red sticks. And so both red sticks and white sticks have purposes in life, and important purposes.
Jimmy Gwetch, thank you for that. One question here from Michelle. She asks, I enjoyed the presentation so much. My question, how do you see today's academia accepting this indigenous way of knowledge, or does it now fit into their non-indigenous economy of education?
I believe that it's really, we need to go back and stay connected to who we are and where we come from and our worldviews. In a way, it's really accepting that reconnection is re-educating about who we are, because we need to carry that forward, because we're quickly losing that kind of knowledge. They say when an elder dies, it's like a library burns down. But there's the other kind of knowledge I wanted to make clear. There's the organic knowledge that is the knowledge before Columbus ever arrived, and that kind of knowledge that we have within indigenous groups. Then they can still carry that kind of organic knowledge forward. What now we're seeing among Native scholars is really kind of a second kind of knowledge that is like a foil that bounces off the binary relationship between Indians and whites. And so it's really kind of a protest knowledge. Vine Deloria, who I knew pretty well, is that kind of, taking the white man's knowledge and turn it around and using it against him, that kind of conflict or pushing back, for survival. And it's not that all Indian knowledge is in that way, but more scholars who've been raised not close to their traditions have adopted that kind of decolonization approach. And so I just want to make clear that there's two kinds, I believe, of traditional knowledge among Native people.
That's a great point. No, thank you for that. So we don't have any more questions. I just wanted to extend, if anybody else had any questions, to type in. But if not, I think I can kind of say thank you myself. I mean, this is the last of our webinars and for this season, basically. And I wanted to thank you very, very much for your time today and just imparting your knowledge and sharing everything with us today. One quick question from Jill says, which of your books speaks to what we have heard today? Marcy Cho.
Probably three of them. Well, the one called Call for Change is really challenging academia to look at the third dimension side and to give us a chance as Native scholars and Native people to present our ideas and our interpretations of history and everything. And so that book is called Call for Change, The Medicine Way of American Indian History. The one that might be really helpful is called The American Indian Mind in a Linear World. And that's really like somebody like myself, my grandparents and so forth, and many of your relatives and maybe yourself. You don't quite fit in because you don't quite think like people, because you're still thinking like your native background and culture. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just different. But to Native people, it's the mainstream that is different. And it's the natural way for people who are close to their traditions. And that book, The American Indian Mind in a Linear World, I wrote that when I was thinking about, if I was a child growing up, I would see the elders speaking Muscogee Creek and sitting close to the earth and drawing with sticks on the ground or with their fingers and talking in that way. And I thought, who represents their epistemology? Who represents their point of view that is very valid, very important, and more inclusive of knowledge? And so I wrote that book, but probably a recent book that came out in 2017, not so recent, but called That's What They Used to Say. And I grew up with a saying called Hamah Mikadat. And so anytime you would hear in conversation, Hamah Mikadat, well, the translation is, that's what they used to say. That's what the elders used to say. And so you would hear that, and I would remember hearing that, and that actually became a song that my dad introduced because my grandmother told him to say, Hamah Mikadat, and the response by the other singers is Hamagachdat, Hamah Mikadat, Hamachgachat. And so Hamah Mikadat is the title of the book. That's what they used to say, like reflections of oral tradition.
Right. Thanks so much. And with that, I will say that this is the end of the session, but I wanted to give you a chance if there's any last words that you wanted to share before you go.
Not really. I hadn't prepared anything, but just thinking out loud is, I think that we really need to kind of know who we are and to learn and to tell people about us in a very respectful way, because we as Native people, we know who we are. And I think it's a pivotal time for people to learn from us in a very important way. The way that we are taking care of the earth, overall, we're not doing a great job. But I think that Native people can become teachers of how that things could be done in a more proper way. And not just taking care of humankind, but the animals, plants, and everything else. Because if we don't, it's going to be a more difficult situation, more challenging. And the way that Native people think, we need those different kind of perspectives, because the most difficult questions that are going to be asked that are not even imagined right now need to be answers to be thought outside of the box. And thinking outside the box will come from Native people. And if you think about this, I just want to leave this with one last statement. There are 195 countries in the world. In the United States alone, there's almost 600 federally recognized tribes and the First Nations. Look at all those different perspectives, and there's only 195 countries in the world. And it's time that, other people, non-Native people, listen to Indigenous people, because we have a lot to offer from our hearts.
Oh. And with that, thank you so much again for all your words. I will hand it back over to Sarah, and just from myself say thank you very much again to everybody who stuck around, everybody who was here through all the webinars. I sincerely appreciate everybody's attendance, all your wonderful questions and your comments. And I look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you, Yuma. Bye.
Thank you.